Philippine Sea, October 25, 1944, 10:50 hours, and Lieutenant Yukio Seki gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero fighter as he approached the American escort carriers at 4,000 feet, the 550-pound bomb strapped beneath his aircraft representing not just ordnance but the embodiment of the Special Attack Force's first official mission, his eyes fixed on USS White Plains through the anti-aircraft bursts that filled the sky like black blossoms of death. Knowing that, in the next 60 seconds either he would succeed in changing naval warfare forever or die trying, while below him the crews of Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, had just survived the most unlikely naval engagement in American history against the Japanese center force, their gunners exhausted from the morning's surface battle, completely unprepared for what was about to descend upon them from above. The 23-year-old lieutenant from Io Seijo had spent the previous 4 days waiting for this moment, watching weather abort mission after mission, his resolve tested each time he climbed into his cockpit only to return to Mabalacat airfield with the bomb still attached. But now the conditions were perfect, visibility clear, the American ships spread before him like pieces on a chessboard, and as he pushed his stick forward into the dive, he thought not of Emperor Hirohito or the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere but of his wife Mariko, whom he had married just 5 months earlier, the woman who would learn of his death through a telegram that would arrive days after his aircraft ceased to exist, transformed into flame and twisted metal on the deck of an American warship. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had conceived this desperate strategy just 6 days earlier at Mabalacat Airfield, standing before the assembled pilots of the 201st Air Group on October 19, 1944, his voice steady as he explained that conventional tactics had failed, that the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Air Fleet possessed only 41 operational aircraft to face the overwhelming American invasion force, that the mathematics of war had reduced their options to 1, and when he asked for volunteers to form the Shimpu Tokubetsu Kogiki Tai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Unit, every pilot's hand rose without hesitation, though Onishi himself would later tell his staff that ordering these young men to their deaths was the most painful decision of his career, a burden that would ultimately drive him to ritual suicide on August 16, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender. Commander Isaichi Tamai had selected Seki to lead the first attack not because he was the most skilled pilot, for Japan had already lost most of its veteran aviators in the Marianas Turkey shoot 4 months earlier, where over 400 carrier-based aircraft and their irreplaceable crews had been shot down in a single day, but because Seki was a Naval Academy graduate who understood both the tactical necessity and the symbolic importance of what they were about to attempt, though privately. Seki had confided to war correspondent Masashi Onoda just days before, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots. I am not going on this mission for the Emperor or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to." The formation of 5 Zeros that morning had taken off from Mabalacat at 07:25 hours, escorted by the legendary ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, whose 67 confirmed kills made him Japan's greatest fighter pilot, though he too would be dead within 24 hours, shot down while returning from this very mission, and as they flew northward toward the American fleet, each pilot carried not just a bomb but also a letter to his family, a lock of hair and fingernail clippings to ensure something could be sent home for burial, the traditional last gifts of a samurai warrior preparing for death, though these were not samurai but young men, many barely out of their teens, who had been given just 7 days of specialized training in how to crash their aircraft into enemy ships. Below them, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 were recovering from the morning's miraculous escape from Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, their crews still trying to comprehend how they had survived a 90-minute running battle against 4 battleships including the super battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a force that should have annihilated them in minutes, but through the heroic sacrifice of the destroyer escorts and destroyers of their screen, particularly USS Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans, who would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously, and the relentless attacks by their aircraft armed with whatever ordnance they could carry, they had convinced Kurita that he faced a much larger force and induced him to withdraw just when victory was within his grasp. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Robert Brunner aboard USS Kalinin Bay was manning his 40mm anti-aircraft mount when the radar operators reported incoming aircraft at 10:48, but after the morning's battle everyone assumed these were returning American planes until they began their dives, and Brunner would later describe the sight that would haunt him for decades. "The planes came in so low we couldn't detect them, then they climbed straight up to 5,000 or 6,000 feet and rolled over into their dives. And that's when we realized they weren't pulling out. They were coming straight at us. And you could see the pilots' faces. Some of them were smiling. Lieutenant Seki's target was USS White Plains, but as every 5-inch gun, 40mm mount and 20mm cannon in the task force opened fire, creating a curtain of steel between him and his objective, his aircraft trailing smoke from multiple hits, he made a split-second decision that would earn him a dubious place in history, banking hard to port toward USS St. Lo, the nearest carrier, pushing his stick forward into a 60-degree dive that would reach 300 miles per hour in its final seconds, the anti-aircraft fire intensifying until it seemed impossible that anything could survive. But physics and determination carried him through the defensive fire. Captain Francis McKenna commanding St. Lo watched the Zero approaching and ordered hard right rudder. But the carrier's maximum speed of 19 knots and sluggish handling made evasion impossible, and at 10:51 hours Lieutenant Seki's aircraft struck the flight deck just aft of the center line. The bomb penetrating into the hangar deck where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed, the explosion igniting aviation gasoline that created a fireball that reached 300 feet into the air, secondary explosions from torpedo and bomb magazines tearing the ship apart from within, while damage control parties fought desperately to contain fires that had already spread beyond any possibility of control. Electrician's mate second-class Orville Bethard was on the flight deck when the Kamikaze hit, the explosion lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the island structure, his eardrums ruptured by the blast, his uniform on fire, and as he stumbled toward the edge of the deck he could see men jumping into the oil-covered water, some of them ablaze, others trying to launch life rafts that were themselves on fire, the organized evacuation that they had drilled for countless times dissolving into chaos as explosions continued to rock the dying ship. And Bethard would later say, "You always think you're prepared for something like that, but when it happens, when you see a plane deliberately fly into your ship, when you realize the pilot wanted to die to kill you, it changes everything you thought you knew about war." Within minutes of Seki's attack, for more kamikazes dove on the escort carriers, one attempting to hit USS Kitkun Bay's bridge but missing and cartwheeling into the sea, its bomb detonating close aboard and sending shrapnel across the flight deck that killed one sailor and wounded 16 others, while USS Kalinin Bay took a direct hit on her flight deck from another Zero that created a massive fire that damage control parties managed to extinguish in less than 5 minutes through heroic efforts that would earn multiple Navy crosses, though not before 60 men were wounded and 5 killed. The carrier's wooden flight deck splintered and burning, her aircraft destroyed, but her crew refusing to abandon their battle stations even as flames surrounded them. USS Fanshawe Bay's gunners shot down 2 Zeros attempting to crash into her, the concentrated fire of her 20mm and 40mm mounts literally disintegrating one aircraft 500 yards from the ship, pieces of the plane and pilot raining down on the flight deck like a grotesque confetti, while the second Kamikaze exploded just 100 feet above the carrier when a 5-inch shell detonated its bomb, the blast wave shattering windows on the bridge and throwing men to the deck, but causing no serious casualties, though every man aboard knew they had survived only through extraordinary gunnery and pure luck. The organized kamikaze attack that Admiral Onishi had envisioned was already devolving into chaos as American anti-aircraft fire proved more effective than anticipated, shooting down or deflecting most of the attackers, but the psychological impact was instantaneous and profound, for these were not ordinary air attacks where a pilot might miss or be driven off by defensive fire. These were guided missiles with human brains that would keep coming despite damage that would have forced any rational pilot to break off, and this realization spread through the fleet faster than any official communication could travel. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, immediately understood that naval warfare had fundamentally changed in the span of 5 minutes, that every assumption about air defense would need to be reconsidered, and as he watched St. Lo burning beyond any hope of salvation, he ordered all ships to implement immediate changes to their anti-aircraft procedures, increasing the range at which they opened fire, instructing gunners to concentrate on the engine and cockpit rather than the wings, and most importantly, to keep firing even after inflicting what would normally be fatal damage to an attacking aircraft. At 11:21 hours, just 30 minutes after Lieutenant Seki's attack, St. Lo capsized and sank, taking 113 of her 889 crew members with her, the first major American warship lost to a kamikaze attack, her survivors struggling in oil-covered water that burned their eyes and lungs, some clinging to debris, others supported only by their life jackets, all of them in shock not just from the loss of their ship but from the nature of the attack that had destroyed her, the deliberate suicide that violated every Western concept of warfare and human nature. The destroyer USS Dennis began picking up survivors at 11:45, her crew throwing cargo nets over the side and hauling oil-covered men aboard. Many of them burned beyond recognition, and pharmacist's mate Robert Davis would later describe the scene in the sick bay. We had men with their skin hanging off in sheets, men with their eyes burned shut, men who were so badly hurt they couldn't even scream, and all of them kept asking the same question: why would anyone deliberately fly into a ship? What kind of enemy were we fighting that valued death over life? While Dennis and other destroyers continued rescue operations, reports of the new Japanese tactic were already being transmitted to Admiral William Halsey commanding the 3rd Fleet and Admiral Thomas Kincaid commanding the 7th Fleet. The messages marked Operational Immediate, the highest priority classification, warning that the Japanese had initiated organized suicide attacks that had already proven effective against escort carriers, that traditional anti-aircraft defenses were insufficient against pilots who intended to die, that immediate changes to fleet defense procedures were required. The second wave of kamikaze attacks came just after noon on October 26, targeting Task Unit 77.4.1, known as Taffy 1, commanded by Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, and this time the Japanese had learned from the morning's attacks, approaching at wave-top height to avoid radar detection before climbing rapidly to attack altitude, giving the defending ships minimal time to react, a tactic that would become standard kamikaze procedure and force the Americans to develop new detection and defense methods. USS Sewanee took the first hit at 12:40 hours when a Zero crashed into her flight deck near the after elevator, its bomb exploding between the flight and hangar decks, creating an inferno that killed 85 sailors instantly and left 58 missing, presumed vaporized in the explosion, while 102 others suffered burns that would require months of treatment, many of them disfigured for life, the psychological trauma often proving harder to treat than the physical wounds. Lieutenant Commander Robert Wood, Sewanee's air officer, organized firefighting efforts despite having his uniform burned off his body, his skin blistering from the heat, directing damage control parties who ran into walls of flame to rescue trapped shipmates, using fog nozzles to create paths through the fire, pulling burned men from ready rooms that had become crematoriums, and Wood would later receive the Navy Cross for his actions, though he would say the real heroes were the 18-year-old sailors who followed him into the inferno without hesitation. 20 minutes after the first hit, another kamikaze struck Sewanee forward of the after elevator, this attack even more devastating than the first, destroying 9 aircraft on the flight deck and creating a fire that merged with the earlier blaze to engulf the entire after section of the ship, forcing damage control parties to flood ammunition magazines to prevent catastrophic explosions, a decision that saved the ship but left her listing badly to starboard, barely able to maintain steerage. USS Santee had already survived one kamikaze hit that morning at 0740 when a Zero crashed through her flight deck, and at 0757 she had been torpedoed by the submarine I-56, making her the only ship in the Pacific War to suffer both kamikaze and submarine attacks on the same day, her crew fighting fires and flooding simultaneously, yet maintaining flight operations to protect the other carriers, launching fighters even as damage control parties worked around them, an extraordinary display of damage control efficiency that would become a case study at the Naval War College. The combat air patrol fighters found themselves facing an entirely new challenge, trying to intercept aircraft whose pilots had no intention of surviving, who would continue their attacks even with engines on fire and control surfaces shot away, and Lieutenant Vernon Michael of Fighting Squadron 27 would later describe the frustration. We'd make a perfect bounce, put 200 rounds into a Zero, see pieces flying off, the engine smoking, and the guy would just keep boring in on the carriers. We had to literally shoot them to pieces, blow them apart in the air, because anything less and they'd still try to crash into a ship. By 1400 hours on October 26th, the fleet had suffered 7 ships hit by kamikazes in less than 28 hours, with over 300 sailors killed and more than 700 wounded, casualties that exceeded many conventional battles, and the psychological impact was even greater than the physical damage, for every sailor in the fleet now understood that they faced an enemy who had weaponized death itself, who had turned the human survival instinct upside down, creating a form of warfare that Western military doctrine had never contemplated. Admiral Kincaid convened an emergency meeting of his staff aboard his flagship USS Wasatch that afternoon. The discussion focused entirely on developing immediate countermeasures to the kamikaze threat, and the consensus was unanimous that traditional naval anti-aircraft doctrine, developed over years of combat against conventional air attacks, was inadequate against suicide attacks, that entirely new tactics would need to be developed, tested, and implemented while under continuous threat of further attacks. Commander William Copeland, whose destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts had been sunk during the morning surface action, was among those providing input despite being a survivor himself, and he emphasized that the kamikaze attacks had created a morale crisis that was potentially more dangerous than the physical threat. The men can handle being shot at, they can handle conventional bombing, but the idea that the enemy wants to die, that death is their objective, not something to be avoided, it's shaking them to their core. We need to address the psychological aspect as urgently as the tactical. The first defensive adaptation implemented within hours of the initial attacks was to increase the range of anti-aircraft engagement, opening fire at maximum effective range rather than waiting for optimal shooting distance, accepting lower hit percentages in exchange for more opportunities to destroy or deflect incoming kamikazes, and gun crews were instructed to maintain continuous fire even if the target appeared to be damaged or out of control. A lesson learned from watching smoking. Burning Zeros still complete their attacks. Radar operators were ordered to report any aircraft approaching the fleet as potentially hostile regardless of IFF, identification friend or foe, signals. As the Japanese had learned to follow returning American aircraft to penetrate the fleet's defenses, and combat air patrol stations were moved further from the carriers, establishing a defensive perimeter at 50 miles rather than the previous 25, though this stretched the fighters' endurance and reduced the number available for immediate fleet defense. The most significant immediate change was in damage control procedures, with all ships ordered to maintain general quarters continuously during daylight hours when air attack was possible, fuel lines drained when not actively refueling aircraft, ammunition moved from ready positions to magazines when not immediately needed, and firefighting equipment pre-positioned throughout the ship rather than stored in lockers, changes that would save countless lives in the months ahead but that placed enormous strain on crews already exhausted from continuous combat operations. Captain Calvin Durgin, commanding the escort carrier USS Macon Island and one of the senior carrier captains in the fleet, issued his own tactical directive to his ship that night that would become the template for fleet-wide doctrine. Every gun that can bear on an incoming kamikaze will fire continuously until the aircraft is destroyed or impacts. Gunners will not cease fire because the aircraft appears damaged. Gun captains will not wait for firing solutions from directors but will engage, under local control if necessary, and any aircraft approaching this ship in a dive will be considered hostile and engaged immediately. The Navy's Operations Research Group, established just weeks earlier in October 1944 specifically to analyze combat effectiveness, immediately began collecting data on the kamikaze attacks, interviewing survivors, analyzing damage patterns, studying which defensive measures had been effective and which had failed. Their preliminary report completed within 48 hours recommending radical changes to fleet anti-aircraft doctrine that would have been considered heretical just days earlier. The report's most significant finding was that the kamikaze success rate was nearly 18%, meaning almost 1 in 5 suicide attackers successfully hit their targets, compared to less than 2% for conventional bombing attacks, making them 9 times more effective than traditional airstrikes, a statistical reality that meant the Japanese, despite their inferior numbers and aircraft, had found a way to inflict disproportionate damage on the American fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, already famous for developing the Thatch Weave defensive fighter tactic, was brought in to develop fighter defense specifically against kamikazes, and within 24 hours he had outlined what would become known as the Big Blue Blanket strategy, positioning fighters in continuous patrols over Japanese airfields to destroy kamikazes before they could launch, though this would not be fully implemented until the Okinawa campaign 5 months later. The psychological impact on American sailors required equally urgent attention, with fleet chaplains and medical officers working to address the trauma of facing an enemy who sought death, and Chaplain Joseph O'Callaghan aboard USS Franklin would later write. The men needed to understand that the kamikaze pilots were not superhuman, not possessed of some mystical power, but young men forced by their government to die, that their attacks could be defeated by superior training, equipment, and determination, that American technology and tactics would overcome Japanese fanaticism. Ships' captains were instructed to conduct immediate briefings with their crews, explaining that kamikaze attacks, while frightening, were actually an admission of Japanese weakness, a desperate measure by an enemy who could no longer compete in conventional warfare, that each successful kamikaze attack cost Japan a pilot and aircraft they could not replace, while American industrial production was launching a new ship every day and training thousands of pilots every month. Gun crews received intensive additional training that night and into October 27th, practicing rapid elevation and depression of their weapons to track diving aircraft, learning to lead targets that were accelerating rather than maintaining steady speed, understanding that a kamikaze in its final dive might be traveling at over 400 miles per hour, requiring completely different deflection calculations than conventional attacking aircraft that typically maintained around 250 miles per hour. The 40mm and 20mm gun crews, who would bear the brunt of close-in defense against kamikazes, were drilling on new procedures that emphasized volume of fire over accuracy, creating curtains of steel that incoming aircraft would have to fly through, and gunners were taught to aim for the engine and cockpit rather than the wings or fuselage, as a kamikaze could continue its attack with significant airframe damage as long as the pilot maintained control. 5-inch gun directors were modified to allow for higher angle tracking, as kamikazes often approached at angles that exceeded the previous maximum elevation limits designed for conventional attack profiles, and proximity fuses, which had been restricted in use to prevent the technology from falling into enemy hands, were authorized for unlimited use against kamikaze attacks, their ability to detonate near an aircraft rather than requiring direct impact proving crucial in destroying suicide attackers. Communications procedures were completely revised to account for the speed at which kamikaze attacks developed, with talkers trained to report suicide attack rather than air attack to ensure all stations understood the nature of the threat, and a new warning system was implemented using colored flags and whistles to indicate the direction and imminence of kamikaze attacks, allowing crews who couldn't hear verbal warnings over gunfire to still react appropriately. The carrier air groups modified their tactics within hours, with fighter pilots instructed to pursue damaged Japanese aircraft until they were confirmed destroyed rather than breaking off after inflicting what appeared to be fatal damage, and bomber crews were ordered to prioritize attacks on Japanese airfields and aircraft on the ground, understanding that every plane destroyed on the ground was one that couldn't become a kamikaze. Submarine USS Sterlet, operating off the Philippines, received flash priority orders to establish a picket line specifically to watch for kamikaze formations departing Japanese bases, providing early warning that would give the fleet additional minutes to prepare. And this submarine early warning system would be expanded and refined, eventually becoming a crucial component of the fleet's defensive network against suicide attacks. The logistics officers faced their own crisis, as ammunition expenditure against kamikaze attacks was 5 times higher than against conventional attacks, with ships exhausting their ready ammunition in single engagements, requiring immediate revision of ammunition supply procedures and storage requirements, and emergency requisitions were sent to Pearl Harbor for additional anti-aircraft ammunition, particularly proximity fused shells and 40mm rounds. Medical departments throughout the fleet implemented new burn treatment protocols, as kamikaze attacks produced far more burn casualties than conventional combat, with aviation gasoline creating injuries that required specialized treatment, and corpsmen were trained in emergency burn care procedures that had previously been considered too advanced for field treatment, including fluid replacement therapy and infection prevention in severe burn cases. The intelligence officers began an intensive effort to understand the psychology and organization of the kamikaze units, intercepting and translating Japanese radio communications that revealed the Special Attack Force was not a spontaneous phenomenon but a carefully planned strategic shift, that the Japanese were establishing training programs specifically for suicide attacks, that this was not a temporary expedient but a fundamental change in Japanese military doctrine. Radio intercepts revealed that Vice Admiral Onishi had established formal kamikaze training programs at multiple bases throughout the Philippines, with a curriculum that included not just flying techniques but psychological preparation for death, including visits to Shinto shrines, writing of death poems, and ceremonial sake toasts before missions, rituals designed to prepare young pilots for their one-way missions, though many intercepts also revealed reluctance and fear among the pilots. The fleet's radar systems, designed to track conventional attacks, proved inadequate against kamikazes that approached at wave height before climbing rapidly to attack altitude, and within 24 hours radar operators were retrained to look for these low-level approaches. adjusting their scanning patterns and interpretation procedures, though the ultimate solution would require new radar systems specifically designed for low-level detection. Damage control teams developed new procedures for fighting aviation gasoline fires, which burned hotter and spread faster than other types of fires, pre-positioning foam generators at strategic locations, training crews in foam application techniques, and establishing rapid response teams specifically for flight deck fires, innovations that would save numerous ships in the months ahead when kamikaze attacks intensified. The psychological warfare aspect was not ignored, with American radio broadcasts to Japanese forces emphasizing that kamikaze pilots were being wasted by their government, that their deaths achieved nothing strategically, that Japan was sending its best young men to die for a lost cause. Though these broadcasts had minimal effect on Japanese determination to continue suicide attacks, they did affect morale among conventional Japanese units. By dawn on October 27, 1944, just 48 hours after the first organized kamikaze attack, the United States Navy had implemented dozens of defensive modifications, from tactical changes in fighter deployment to mechanical modifications of gun mounts, from revised damage control procedures to new medical treatment protocols, demonstrating the American military's ability to adapt rapidly to new threats, though every officer understood this was just the beginning of a new and terrible phase of the Pacific War. The escort carriers, which had borne the brunt of the initial kamikaze attacks, developed specific defensive measures including zigzag patterns designed to complicate the kamikaze's final approach, launching all aircraft immediately when attacks were detected to prevent them from becoming additional fuel for fires, and maintaining continuous fighter coverage directly overhead rather than relying solely on distant combat air patrols. Commander Fitzhugh Lee, Air Group Commander aboard USS Manila Bay, instituted what became known as jack patrols, fighters positioned directly over the fleet at maximum altitude to dive on kamikazes as they began their attacks, providing a last-ditch defense when combat air patrol failed to intercept, and these jack patrols would account for dozens of kamikaze kills in the coming months, though they required precise coordination to avoid friendly fire incidents. The destroyer escorts and destroyers, which formed the screen for the carriers, developed their own tactical innovations including the turn-toward maneuver, where screening ships would actually turn toward incoming kamikazes to present a smaller target and bring maximum firepower to bear, accepting the risk of being hit to protect the more valuable carriers, a tactic that required extraordinary courage from destroyer crews who knew they were making themselves deliberate targets. Night kamikaze attacks, which began within days of the first daylight attacks, required entirely different defensive measures with radar-directed fighter operations, star shell illumination patterns, and searchlight protocols all developed through trial and error, each innovation paid for in ships damaged and lives lost, but gradually building an effective night defense system that would be crucial during the Okinawa campaign. The maintenance crews developed rapid repair techniques for kamikaze damage, prefabricating steel plates that could be quickly welded over holes in flight decks, stockpiling timber for temporary deck repairs, and establishing mobile repair teams that could move between ships to assist with damage control, innovations that would allow damaged ships to return to action in days rather than weeks. The ammunition handlers modified their procedures to prevent chain reaction explosions, storing bombs and torpedoes in widely separated locations rather than concentrated magazines, accepting the inefficiency of dispersed storage in exchange for reduced vulnerability to catastrophic secondary explosions, a lesson learned from St. Lo's loss where concentrated ordnance had turned a single hit into a ship-killing catastrophe. Communications officers developed a new vocabulary for kamikaze attacks, standardizing terminology across the fleet to prevent confusion during the chaos of an attack, with specific code words for different approach patterns, attack angles, and defensive responses, ensuring that every ship understood exactly what was happening and what response was required regardless of which ship was reporting. The fleet's meteorologists began tracking weather patterns that favored kamikaze operations, particularly low cloud cover that allowed concealed approaches, and began issuing kamikaze weather warnings that would trigger increased defensive readiness. Understanding that certain atmospheric conditions gave the suicide attackers significant advantages that needed to be countered with heightened vigilance. The naval architects and engineers at Pearl Harbor and stateside shipyards began designing modifications specifically to counter kamikaze attacks, including additional anti-aircraft gun mounts, improved armor around vital spaces, and redesigned fuel systems that could be rapidly purged to prevent fires, modifications that would be incorporated into new construction and retrofitted to existing ships during their next maintenance periods. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victims, with sailors throughout the Pacific Fleet experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms that were initially dismissed as combat fatigue but gradually recognized as a specific response to the unique horror of suicide attacks, leading to the establishment of specialized treatment programs. The question that haunted every American sailor was not whether they could defeat kamikaze attacks but what kind of enemy they were fighting who would embrace death so readily, who would turn their aircraft into guided missiles with human pilots, who would celebrate death rather than mourn it, and this cultural gulf would influence American military thinking about Japan for the remainder of the war and beyond. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received the combined reports of the first 48 hours of kamikaze attacks on October 28, and his response was characteristically direct. "We will adapt, we will overcome, and we will prevail, but we must recognize that the enemy has chosen to make this a war of annihilation, and we must respond accordingly with every technological, tactical, and strategic advantage at our disposal." The industrial response was equally swift, with American factories immediately increasing production of proximity fuses, anti-aircraft ammunition, and radar systems, while research facilities accelerated development of new defensive technologies including improved radar, guided anti-aircraft missiles, and even early computer systems for fire control, innovations that would not only counter the kamikaze threat but revolutionize naval warfare. Training facilities in the United States modified their curricula within days of receiving reports of kamikaze attacks, adding specialized anti-suicide attack training to gunnery schools, teaching radar operators to recognize kamikaze approach patterns, and most importantly, preparing new sailors psychologically for an enemy who sought death, attempting to inoculate them against the shock that had affected the first victims. The British Pacific Fleet, preparing to join the Americans in the final campaigns against Japan, studied the kamikaze attacks intensively, and their analysis concluded that their armored flight decks would provide better protection than the wooden decks of American carriers. A prediction that would prove accurate when British carriers survived kamikaze hits that would have destroyed American carriers, though at the cost of reduced aircraft capacity. The submarine force adapted its mission to include early warning of kamikaze formations, with submarines positioned along likely approach routes to provide radar warning of incoming attacks, and submarine-launched reconnaissance aircraft began monitoring Japanese airfields for kamikaze preparations, providing intelligence that would allow preemptive strikes against suicide units before they could launch. The cost of defending against kamikaze attacks was enormous, not just in ammunition expended and ships damaged, but in the constant stress on crews who had to maintain maximum alertness for hours or even days at a time, knowing that a moment's inattention could mean death, a psychological burden that would lead to increased rotation policies and rest periods, though never enough to fully alleviate the strain. By the end of October 27, 1944, the United States Navy had learned more about defending against suicide attacks in 48 hours than military theorists had contemplated in decades of strategic planning, lessons written in blood and fire, paid for with the lives of sailors who had faced something unprecedented in Western military experience, an enemy who had weaponized the human survival instinct itself. The immediate lessons were tactical: how to position fighters, how to concentrate anti-aircraft fire, how to manage damage control against aviation fuel fires. But the deeper lessons were strategic and psychological, understanding that the Pacific War had entered a new phase where conventional military logic no longer applied, where the enemy would trade lives for damage at a ratio that no Western military would consider sustainable. The kamikaze attacks would continue for the remainder of the war, intensifying during the Philippines campaign and reaching their crescendo at Okinawa, where mass attacks by hundreds of suicide aircraft would test every defensive innovation developed in those first crucial 48 hours. But the foundation of American kamikaze defense was established in those 2 days in October 1944, when the fleet learned to fight an enemy who embraced death. The final tally for the first 48 hours of organized kamikaze operations was sobering. 7 ships hit, over 300 killed, 700 wounded, 1 escort carrier sunk, and several others severely damaged. But more importantly, the entire defensive doctrine of the United States Navy had been revolutionized, adapted to face a threat that no military manual had anticipated, that no war college had studied, that no admiral had planned for. Lieutenant Yukio Seki's successful attack on USS St. Lo had indeed changed naval warfare forever, forcing the Americans to develop countermeasures that would influence military thinking for generations, from the development of automated close-in weapon systems to the psychology of defending against suicide attacks. lessons that would prove relevant decades later when other enemies would adopt similar tactics, though none would match the scale of the Japanese kamikaze campaign. The survivors of those first attacks would carry the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Men like Orville Bethard who would wake decades later still hearing the sound of aircraft engines and power dives, still seeing the faces of kamikaze pilots in their final moments, still wondering what could drive a man to embrace death so willingly, questions that would never have complete answers but would forever change how Americans understood the nature of war and sacrifice. The official after-action reports filed by the fleet commanders were clinical in their language, discussing hit percentages, ammunition expenditure rates, and damage assessments, but between the lines was the human story of sailors who had faced something beyond their comprehension and found ways to fight back, to adapt, to overcome, demonstrating the resilience that would ultimately lead to victory in the Pacific War despite the terrible cost in lives and suffering. Admiral Onishi's desperate gamble had succeeded tactically in that first 48 hours, proving that kamikaze attacks could inflict significant damage on the American fleet, but strategically it had failed, for instead of breaking American will it had strengthened American determination to end the war as quickly as possible, to prevent more young Japanese men from being forced to throw away their lives in futile suicide attacks that could delay but never prevent Japan's ultimate defeat. The transformation of American naval defense doctrine in those first 48 hours after the initial kamikaze attacks represented one of the most rapid military adaptations in history, a complete reimagining of fleet defense accomplished while under continuous combat conditions, with exhausted crews modifying procedures, testing new tactics, and implementing changes literally under fire, demonstrating the flexibility and innovation that would characterize American military operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The lessons learned in those crucial first hours would save countless lives in the months ahead. As American gunners became expert at shooting down diving aircraft, fighter pilots perfected interception techniques specific to suicide attackers, and damage control teams developed procedures that could save ships that would have been lost to fires and secondary explosions, turning the initial shock of kamikaze attacks into a grim but manageable aspect of naval warfare. The radar operators who had initially struggled to detect low-flying kamikazes developed techniques for identifying the characteristic approach patterns of suicide attackers, the sudden climb from wave height to attack altitude that became known as the kamikaze pop-up, enabling fighters to be vectored for interception in the crucial seconds between detection and attack, often making the difference between a successful defense and a ship lost. The Medical Corps' rapid adaptation to treating burn victims would revolutionize military medicine, with procedures developed under the desperate conditions of kamikaze attacks becoming standard treatment protocols that would save lives not just in warfare but in civilian applications for decades to come. Innovations born from the necessity of treating hundreds of severely burned sailors in conditions that would have overwhelmed traditional medical responses. The intelligence gathered from shot-down kamikazes and intercepted communications revealed the human dimension of the Special Attack Force, the young pilots who wrote final letters to their mothers, who questioned privately whether their sacrifice would matter, who went to their deaths not as fanatics but as young men caught in a military system that demanded the ultimate sacrifice, intelligence that humanized the enemy even as Americans prepared to defend against them. The fleet that emerged from those first 48 hours of kamikaze attacks was fundamentally different from the one that had entered them, not just in tactics and equipment but in understanding of what modern war could demand, that technology and industrial supremacy could be challenged by human will carried to its ultimate extreme, that victory would require not just superior firepower but superior adaptation to whatever desperate measures a cornered enemy might employ. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, which had borne the brunt of the first attacks, became the laboratory for anti-kamikaze innovation, their crews developing and testing defensive measures that would be adopted throughout the fleet, their experience becoming the curriculum for training programs that would prepare the thousands of ships and millions of sailors who would face kamikaze attacks in the campaigns ahead. The immediate distribution of lessons learned from the first kamikaze attacks through the Pacific Fleet's communication network ensured that ships that had not yet faced suicide attacks could prepare, could drill their crews, could modify their procedures, could steel themselves psychologically for what was coming. A rapid dissemination of combat knowledge that would prove crucial when kamikaze attacks spread throughout the Philippines and beyond. The cost of defending against kamikaze attacks would ultimately influence American strategic planning for the invasion of Japan, with estimates of casualties from suicide attacks during Operation Downfall reaching into the hundreds of thousands. projections that would contribute to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than accept the casualties that an invasion defended by thousands of kamikaze aircraft would entail. The technological innovations sparked by the need to defend against kamikaze attacks would accelerate the development of guided missiles, automated defensive systems, and electronic warfare, compressed into months developments that might have taken years in peacetime, innovations that would define naval warfare in the jet age and beyond, all traced back to those desperate hours in October 1944 when sailors faced an enemy who turned death into a weapon. The human cost of those first 48 hours extended far beyond the immediate casualties, with thousands of sailors experiencing psychological trauma that would affect them for decades. Men who had faced conventional combat without breaking but found themselves shaken by an enemy who violated the fundamental assumption that all combatants sought survival, a psychological wound that proved harder to heal than physical injuries. The Japanese pilots who conducted those first attacks, particularly Lieutenant Seki and his fellow members of the Shikishima unit, became both heroes and victims in Japanese history, celebrated for their sacrifice but also mourned as young men whose lives were thrown away in a desperate gamble that could only delay defeat, their deaths achieving tactical success but strategic futility, a lesson in the limits of human sacrifice against industrial and technological superiority. The American response to kamikaze attacks would influence military doctrine for generations, establishing procedures for defending against suicide attacks that would be studied and adapted by militaries worldwide, recognizing that the weaponization of human life represented a form of asymmetric warfare that could challenge conventional military superiority, requiring specialized defensive measures and psychological preparation. The final irony of the kamikaze campaign was that it achieved the opposite of its intended effect, for rather than breaking American will to continue the war, it convinced American leaders and citizens that Japan would never surrender conventionally, that every Japanese soldier and civilian had been indoctrinated to choose death over defeat, a perception that would justify the use of unlimited force to end the war, including the atomic bombs that would ultimately make further kamikaze attacks unnecessary. As the sun set on October 27, 1944, marking the end of the first 48 hours of organized kamikaze warfare, the men of the Pacific Fleet understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, that the war had become something darker and more desperate than anyone had imagined, that victory would require not just defeating the Japanese military but overcoming an enemy who had chosen to make death itself a weapon, a challenge that would test American resolve, ingenuity, and humanity in ways that would define the remainder of the Pacific War and echo through history as a reminder of war's capacity to drive human beings to the ultimate extremes of sacrifice and survival.